Today we're talking about Chapter 11, Sections 5 and 6, which will focus on speciation and extinction. Speciation is when new species arise, and we saw this when we looked at Darwin's finches on the Galapagos. The thing that leads to speciation is when populations become isolated from each other, meaning there's no gene flow. Gene flow, if you remember, is when members from one population take their alleles for a certain gene into a different population, and that tends to keep the populations very similar to each other. Well, if you isolate them and you stop that gene flow, the two populations start to become more different, and they could eventually become separate species. And these genetic differences in the isolated populations can really add up over generations. We can see that in the ancestral finch that used to live on the Galapagos very early in the colonization of the islands, has diversified into all these different types of finches. Particularly looking at finches that live on the ground, you'll notice that they have these large, thick beaks because they tend to eat food that is difficult to crack open on the ground. Versus this line of descent in the trees, eating a bud of a tree or an insect that lives in the bark of the tree requires a different beak shape. So the variation that existed in those insect eaters, for example, the variation of long, thin beak was beneficial. That got passed down because the individuals that had beaks that were long and thin were able to better get food and therefore reproduce and pass that down to their offspring. So there's two types of speciation depending on how it occurs. They're called allopatric and sympatric. Allopatric speciation is when there is a physical barrier that divides a population. So something like a canyon opening up right in the middle of a population. If this side stops breeding with the individuals on the other side, then they become isolated from each other. They stop the gene flow and they could become separate species. Sympatric speciation can also occur. That would be if you have a new population that is within the other population, but for some reason they stop breeding with each other. We'll talk about some examples of that on the next screen. But maybe that could be something like simply a mutation that makes the flower open at a different time of year. If the flowers aren't open at the same time, or since these are pine trees, if their pine cones don't open at the same time, then they cannot breed with each other, and you can have a new population forming right in the middle of your original population. So that, again, is called sympatric speciation if they occur when the populations are still physically in contact with each other, they just aren't reproducing. The thing that is common between both types of speciation is the idea of reproductive isolation. You must have reproductive isolation in order to have speciation. You have to have all gene flow stop between the two populations, and they have to be completely isolated in order to turn into two different species. So reproductive isolation is divided into two categories based on when it occurs. It is either considered to be pre-zygotic, pre means before, and zygotic refers to the zygote. So all of these examples of pre-zygotic isolation, those are going to be isolating mechanisms that prevent the formation of a zygote, like geographic isolation, when the finch populations became separated from the mainland and they were living on different islands and they stopped breeding with each other. That would be pre-zygotic. You could have behavioral isolation. Humpback whales attract a mate by singing mating songs. And it has been studied that humpback whales living in different oceans are going to sing different songs. Therefore, that behavior of the type of song they're singing, if they're not singing a song that the other whale is interested in hearing, there's not going to be any breeding, there's no formation of a zygote, so those populations would be isolated with a pre-zygotic isolating mechanism. And finally, temporal isolation. We briefly mentioned this on the previous slide. If you have different flowering seasons in plants, The flowers are the reproductive structure. If they're not open at the same time, then those two populations cannot breed with each other. They do not form a zygote, so that would be prezygotic. Our post-zygotic isolation would be if there is a mating attempt and you do produce a zygote. For some reason, that zygote may not be viable. That's our first example, meaning that the zygote doesn't really develop. It can't live. Frog populations do this because they have external fertilization. So if the sperm from the wrong species tries to fertilize an egg, then that egg, as it's developing, is going to fail to develop the proper body tissues. Sometimes the zygote is produced, but it's sterile. So that's our second example of a post-zygotic isolating mechanism. The famous example here would be a horse and a donkey. They produce a mule, but that mule cannot reproduce. A mule is sterile. So that leads to reproductive isolation because the horse and the donkey population, they can't keep their offspring sterile and mating with each other. So that is isolating the horse population from the donkey population. And that would be an example of a post-zygotic mechanism. Lastly, in Chapter 11, Section 6, we will bring everything together and talk about the overall patterns of evolution in different species. And we will revisit that idea. You see it here in this example. When we were talking about evidence for evolution, we said biogeography shows us how evolution happens independently in different isolated areas, like all of these flightless birds that live on different continents. They have similar adaptations because they live in similar environments, not necessarily because they inherited those adaptations from a common ancestor. So if you remember when we discussed this, we did learn that is called convergent evolution. Convergent, when things are converging, they're coming together. So convergent evolution would be when different species are becoming more similar to each other, even though they're unrelated, because they live in a similar environment, they're facing similar selective pressures, and so they are developing similar adaptations. Another example of this would be the dolphin, which you see in the top picture. That is a mammal. And the shark in the bottom picture, that is a fish. Mammals and fish are not very closely related. They have a pretty distant common ancestor. So the reason why these two look similar is not because they inherited their body shape from a recent ancestor, but it's because this body shape is well suited for the habitat where it lives. Dolphins and sharks both live in the ocean, so they have a very streamlined shape to their body. They have fins instead of limbs. They even have this coloration pattern where it's kind of a dark gray on top and a lighter kind of white color on the belly. You see that in both of them. It's a pattern called counter shading, and they are a result of the environment and not a common ancestor. So this is convergent evolution, where distantly related species are becoming more similar because of a similarity in habitat. Divergent evolution would be the opposite. If you have species that are becoming more different from each other, even though they come from a common ancestor, that would be divergent evolution. So we have here the ancestor of the fox. It has two different lines of descent. One line of descent leads to the kit fox. This lives in a desert habitat. It has a lighter color. It has larger ear surface area relative to the size of its head to help dissipate that heat. Versus the red fox here, obviously a different color, lives in a different habitat. It lives in a more wooded environment. So it is more well suited for a woodland habitat, whereas the kit fox is more suited for the desert. They both came from this recent common ancestor, but they are evolving to look more and more different from each other through divergent evolution. Species can also impact other species. So if you have two or more species that are evolving together, that's called co-evolution. Co means together. And this is commonly seen in the relationship between a pollinator and the plant. For example, we have the hummingbird with its long beak shape is very well suited to reach the nectar at the base of this flower here. So over millions of years, this evolutionary relationship has favored this long tubular shape in the flower and the corresponding long shape in the beak. Another example is any kind of symbiotic relationship. This happens to be the ant and the acacia tree. The acacia tree that has these hollow thorns allows the ant, which is very kind of elongated and streamlined, to live inside of the thorn, and then the ant comes out of the acacia plant and it bites whatever thing is trying to eat the acacia tree's leaves. So over time, that shape of the ant itself and the shape and the hollowness of the thorn, that has been an example of coevolution because it was mutually beneficial. It doesn't always have to be a beneficial relationship, however. Coevolution can also happen between predator and prey. The example that we have here is the crab, which is a natural predator of the snail. And the snail being prey, the snails that have the stronger shells are going to have an advantage. So over time, the snail shells get stronger and stronger. Well, that means the crabs with the stronger claws are going to now have an advantage. So the predator, or the crab, is also developing stronger claws as this snail is getting stronger. So that means that the shell needs to be even stronger, maybe have these spiny protrusions on them, which again leads to even larger, stronger claws in the crab and stronger spiny shells in the snail. We will call this an evolutionary arms race because essentially, as soon as the prey is evolving a better defense against the predator population is also going to be evolving to be able to get to the prey because everyone has to be able to eat. Now, the opposite of speciation is going to be extinction. Extinction, you all know what this is when species are eliminated from Earth. And species are always going extinct. We call that background extinctions. They happen roughly at the same rate that new species would appear, and they normally just affect a few species in a small area, very localized extinction events. But over time, there have been at least 5 mass extinctions. These are much more rare and much more intense, and they destroy species at the global level. So these are the things that are caused by very catastrophic worldwide global events. And you can see this graph shows extinction rate in terms of the number of families that go extinct every million years. These spikes here are the 5 mass extinctions. Don't worry about memorizing what they are and when they happened. But what you should notice if we compare them here is that these are the 5 mass extinctions. It shows you like what percent of the species went extinct for each one. The thing that I want you to see is look at the causes. We're talking about cooling, warming. So shift in climate is one. Asteroid impact, we see that here. We see that in the KT extinction. This is the extinction that killed the dinosaurs. And things like geologic activity, volcanic gases, methane, CO2, all of those are common things that caused these mass extinctions. And finally, our last idea in Chapter 11, Section 6, is the idea of speciation occurring in very specific patterns. Initially, Charles Darwin himself suggested that species would change gradually and slowly throughout geologic time. So as time passed, there would be gradual small changes that happened, and over time that led to the production of a new species. This is an idea that we call gradualism, and it was taken from that same idea in geology, just applied to living things. But a newer theory that was proposed in 1972, called punctuated equilibrium, also has evidence in the fossil record. In punctuated equilibrium, You have episodes of speciation that occur very quickly, very rapidly in geologic time, and then the descendants from that speciation event are relatively stable for a long time in between. And this was a revision of Darwin's idea that all species were gradually changing over time. It sounds like punctuated equilibrium and gradualism are in conflict with each other, but in reality, there is evidence for both theories in the fossil record. So they are both likely ways that evolution has occurred in different species and under different environmental conditions. We can't necessarily say evolution always follows the same pattern in every single species. So there is certainly evidence for both of these in the fossil record. Let's look specifically at that punctuated equilibrium example and what happens during punctuated equilibrium. In the process of speciation itself, species can undergo what we call adaptive radiation. Adaptive radiation is what's happening in the species when you have an ancestral species. All of a sudden, its descendants are diversifying into many different species, all pretty much at the same time in terms of geologic time. This is normally in relation to some kind of change in the environment. If the environment changes, such as when you have a mass extinction, that new environment, all of a sudden, whatever species are left, they can go forth and colonize that new environment in many different ways, and that happens very rapidly following the extinction event. This is exactly what we saw after the extinction of the dinosaurs. The dinosaurs went extinct around 65 million years ago because of a meteor impact with Earth, and it wiped out all of the dinosaur species from the planet. However, some species of mammals were able to survive, and they probably survived by being small and burrowing underground, surviving on roots of plants. Even though there wasn't really a lush ecosystem on the surface of the Earth, they survived long enough to be able to come back out after the dinosaurs were gone and take over those empty ecological niches or the roles in the environment that the dinosaurs used to occupy. And that began what we call the age of mammals today, where we have a huge amount of mammal diversity on Earth. So that's going to end our discussion of Chapter 11, Sections 5 and 6. If you missed anything from this presentation or any previous presentations, please make sure that you ask those questions in class, and hopefully you found this to be helpful.